Okay. Justin is doing our class today. Justin grew up in Virginia and has been studying and practicing Buddhism since 2001. He has a BA in Religious Studies from Naropa University and an MA in Buddhist Studies from Atripa College, two of the three Buddhist colleges in the United States. He has worked for the FPMT International Office as their donor services coordinator since 2013 and is the former spiritual program coordinator of Lama Yeshe House in Denver, Colorado. Justin is an FPMT registered teacher and an instructor with the Foundation for Developing Compassion and Wisdom, an organization devoted to Lama Yeshe's wisdom, vision of universal education. He currently lives in San Diego with his wife, Katrina, and their dog, Bianca. And with that, Justin, how did you want to do the prayers at the beginning?
Maybe in a few minutes, but maybe we can arrive and settle first and just kind of check in and then
okay.
Then start prayers once we. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. Great. And then I guess how will somebody share a screen of the prayers or?
I can do that.
Okay, awesome. And Shad, I was trying to get speaker view so I could see it when you speak, but it just shows myself. So that's not very helpful. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining today. This is nice, interesting kind of mix to connect with everyone from homes on Zoom and also at the center there at TKL. I lived in Delray Beach for a short time, a little bit less than a year, so kind of have a felt memory of the space there. I haven't been to the center in a long, it must have been 15 years ago. So we are definitely in a different building than it was then. So maybe we actually can spend a few minutes just kind of arriving where we are seated. Maybe just guiding a very simple breathing practice just for a couple minutes, just to let go of some of our thinking activity and settle and rest. Become more present. And there's a nice, really simple technique for helping kind of settle our nervous systems at the outset. And basically you just take a few deep breaths, taking very slow, mindful breaths, and you breathe in through your nose, taking a full breath. And then as you breathe out through your mouth as if you're breathing out through a thin straw. So and you can repeat those as many times as you like, 3, 4, 5 times. And then after a few breaths, then come into just a natural breath. And then as you move to a natural breath, sometimes at first, before moving your attention to your breath, it can be helpful just to kind of check in with the felt experience of your body. So maybe noticing the sensations of the clothes on your skin, feeling the weight of your body in your seat, and some sensations in the backside of your legs. Just feeling your sense of bones, and temperature in the room. As you breathe, allow a kind of settling and relaxing awareness of this felt experience of your body. Just simply having awareness of that sensory experience of just sitting where you are. If you're noticing any tension in the body, come as best you can, try to relax the tension. And then also in the same way, maybe noticing any tension in the mind, any excitement or expectations or curiosity, maybe giving yourself some permission just to let go and simply be for a few moments. No, not trying to do anything in particular, not trying to achieve calm necessarily. Just trying to allow ourselves to enjoy a bit of simplicity, just being for a moment. And then another very valuable, kind of foundational ingredient or element in developing mindfulness is to check in with ourselves and have a sense of intention or knowing or connecting with a sense of intention or motivation for why we're here, why we're doing what we're doing. So if we'd like just to reflect for a minute into what kind of interests or desire brought us to this course. What are you kind of seeking, or what kind of drew you into this, exploring these topics? And if we can, connecting and noticing the qualities of kindness and compassion that might be inherent in your interest. We're exploring these teachings these practices in Buddha's tradition. We develop a sense of kindness in ourselves because we naturally value kindness, we value compassion, we personally value love, it's a peace, freedom. And recognizing that these are true values in ourselves. It's something we really care about. Maybe also that we want to embody these values so that we can make a positive impact in this world, which very much needs these qualities in the lives of those that are around us. So for the next hour, 20 minutes or so, if you like, maybe you can have the sense of intention as we explore these teachings together. So that they become an expression of these values, an action of these values. So they're expression of our values of kindness and compassion, love. And then, as part of the tradition, an expression of this kind of intention is the refuge and what we call the refuge and bodhicitta prayer. And we'll get more into what these prayers mean as we go through the course. But if you're not familiar, you're welcome just to listen, or if you want to join in, please do. And basically, the refuge and bodhicitta prayer in a nutshell is an expression of that kind of recognition of our basic goodness and recognition of these inherent heart values, and a wish for us to be able to fulfill or actualize them into their fullest capacity so that we can be of great benefit to others. So we can, if you like, we'll recite these 3 times in English. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Great, thank you. And so, yeah, so I'll start babbling for a little while, and please feel free to interrupt me if you have a question. And maybe we can go until noon East Coast time, maybe, and then let's take just a quick break if you need, stretch or bio break. Yeah, so this class was created through the FPMT Education Services. So it's been around as the kind of one of the introductions to kind of the philosophical and practical kind of basic map of the Buddhist tradition from the perspective of this Tibetan Buddhist lineage. So very, and the map is as complex and as detailed and vast and brilliant as you'd like to dive into. But we'll do it over four nice sessions together on Sundays the next 4 weeks. So the idea is basically give some historical context to how the tradition evolved over time, starting from the Buddha, and then its kind of progression and spreading through Asia, and particularly how it landed and evolved in Tibet, and to where we're at now. And so today it'll be kind of a quick backdrop of the content in that way. And then over the next few weeks, we'll focus on kind of introducing the kind of what they call the three principal aspects of the path, or kind of the three main qualities we're seeking to cultivate, that all the practices, all the our spiritual process are leading to these kind of three qualities. So we'll kind of spend a lot of our time just kind of unpacking what those are, because they're very practical and kind of the heart qualities that we're really working on in our training as in the Buddhist tradition. So now I guess I'll just kind of go into a real kind of brief history. Is anybody not familiar with the Buddha's story at all? Buddha's life story? People have a sense of, probably do. So thinking about the Buddha from a modern context a little bit, just as a kind of a different angle, I guess, looking at the Buddha's life. So basically there was there was a prophecy when the Buddha was born. Like the priest at the time told the Buddha's father, who was the king of the kingdom, that your son's very special, and your son's either going to be a great spiritual teacher or he's going to be a great king, great political leader. And the father over-identified with the Buddha and was like, I want my son to be my heir and a great political leader. And so the father then just proceeded basically to try to not protect, but just hide his son from life, the realities of life, basically. And he created this just kind of like pleasure experience, where everything was beautiful and everything was great, and everything, the Buddha was very kind of an amazing, excellent student and person, and he never left the confines of the royal palace grounds, I guess. So made me think yesterday of the old Jim Carrey movie, The Truman Show. I think there's a Truman Show where they're kind of manipulating his experience. So the Buddha's father was kind of doing that. But then kind of the truth broke through, and the Buddha's curiosity led him to sneak outside the palace a few times, and this is where he started to see the kind of realities of life. And then that kind of sparked a curiosity of him wanting to actually escape fully and take off in the middle of the night one night, to kind of go on his pursuits. And he saw somebody who was sick. He had never seen a sick person before. He saw somebody who was aging. He never seen an aging person before, like a corpse. He also saw a spiritual yogi, and he was escaping at night with his kind of assistant. And so he would ask his assistant, "What's going on with that person? What's going on with that person?" And the assistant would oblige and tell him, "Well, that's somebody who's sick." And he's like, "What's that?" And he's like, "People get sick." Yeah. And yeah, so the Buddha was kind of given this packaged idea of what freedom was, or what happiness was, or fulfillment was. And then he realized it was kind of artificial. And when he had this kind of insight and kind of drive, it's a 6-year process of kind of very intensive, very deep exploration and training. He would go to different teachers and basically learn everything that they had, and he still didn't feel quite like it was hitting the mark. And yeah, so we tried all these spiritual disciplines that were present at the time in India. And this last one, where he was training with 5 friends, where it became extreme deprivation, where he was trying to get rid of what Freud would call maybe the id, like the deep impulse of desire. And their approach that they were training in, his friends, was, if we just deprive ourselves of desire and we'll eventually burn it out. And that wasn't quite working either. And the Buddha was out on a walk one day, and a lady who had a nice bowl of rice porridge, sweet rice. And I think he was eating, they said, like 1 grain of rice a month. So, like, that was his food, was just one single grain of rice per month. And so he's quite hungry, and he just decided to kind of switch it up. And he ate and enjoyed the food that was offered to him. And then that night, he actually sat under a tree, and with the kind of vitality that he received from letting in the nourishment, he sat down, and with the kind of a clarity and determination, and achieved enlightenment that night, actually. Yeah. And I feel like, thinking personally, I see that process almost like I can be the father trying to, like, kind of patch up, give myself comfort, or, distract, avoid, or have certain kind of hopes or expectations about life in a way that's denying just the kind of natural process of life. And I keep getting that, like, lesson over and over again. And so what the Buddha found was that let me say, there's a kind of middle way between the struggle in life. So there can be this freedom that comes when we're able to meet our life struggles with awareness. Yeah. Trying to see where to go with that. Yeah, we got stuff there. Does anybody have any question or thoughts? Before we continue?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Justin. The information that you just related, is that fable, fiction, or did it really happen in the way that it is, stated?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's how the story is told. So after the Buddha became enlightened, he became enlightened at age 35, and he lived to the age of 80. So there was about 45 years where the Buddha was actually traveling around, teaching, kind of establishing the doctrine. And you can hear many different kind of styles of the Buddha's life, depending on what tradition it comes from. But generally, these are kind of the key moments of the Buddhist life that are told. There wasn't written, I think, for a couple hundred years later was when I think the first manuscripts or like written words were starting to kind of be found. So generally that's what's believed to be the kind of Buddhist process, is that he was born of a king. In this region of India, there was the kind of coddling from his father, and then he went on this spiritual quest. And then after his enlightenment, he gave the first teaching, which is kind of where they what's called the first turning of the wheel Dharma. So after he attained enlightenment, he actually sat in the forest for about 7 weeks because he had doubts on whether he would be able to convey or communicate what he had discovered, because it was so beyond thought. Like, he wasn't sure how this could be. What he had experienced was so direct that he wasn't sure if he could convey it through words. And the kind of legend around that is the Indian god Brahma implored the Buddha and offered him this kind of symbolic wheel, and asked the Buddha to kind of please go out and actually share. And so the Buddha just started wandering, and I think the first person he met wasn't impressed, which is very interesting. And then he met his 5 friends who he'd been training with, and his 5 friends kind of, when they saw he kind of given up the strict discipline and ate, they kind of dismissed him as kind of giving up. And but then he met with them, and then they saw that he had something had happened, like he had some sort of breakthrough, and so he gave the first teaching on what he had discovered. And what the first teaching was what's famously called the Four Noble Truths, or translated as the Four Noble Truths. And more literally, what it means is the four aspects or facts or whatever that is truly perceived by somebody who has this realization. So it's the four things that are true for those who are noble. And it's very interesting and very powerful that the word noble was used, nobility, because in the Indian caste system, it was very politically stratified, and you were born into a particular social caste, and that was it for maybe hundreds, thousands of lifetimes. But what the Buddha kind of, and within that, even the religious system was people who were of lesser caste, social caste, were dependent on the Brahmin, the priest caste, for their spirituality. So there was a kind of a social dependence in the spiritual, religious structure of India at the time. And the Buddha's message was, no, nobility is actually an inner quality. It's not a social quality. It's not a social status. It's an inner quality that we have innately within us. We just have to discover what's always been there. And so the Sanskrit, or is Arya, that we translate as noble. So it's the four things that are true to someone who is noble, who has this kind of noble inner quality awakened in them. And that first teaching, so those four noble truths were it's called the first truth of suffering. The second noble truth was the truth of what causes our suffering. The third is the truth of what releases that cause or ends that cause, finishes it. So kind of the truth of the end of suffering. And the fourth noble truth is the truth of a path or a process by which we can discover that freedom from the cause of suffering. So not just there's a cause, because there's a cause, if we can remove the cause, there's an end. And then there's a means to that end. There's a fourth one is there's how do we actually bring that about in us? And yeah, the word suffering is usually what's always been translated. The original word in Pali is dukkha, in Sanskrit as well, dukkha. So it's the truth of dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the end of dukkha, and the path to the end of dukkha. And dukkha is usually translated as suffering, sometimes dissatisfaction, unsatisfactoriness. And the reason why it's a tricky translation is because kind of one of the unique kind of messages the Buddha offered was this definition of dukkha, like what is actually our issue? What is what is the issue? Yeah. And so within this kind of first level of suffering, the deepest level of suffering, even today in our kind of psychology or our culture, it's a bit of a foreign kind of diagnosis. Like it's like in Western psychology, this isn't recognized yet as a possibility, or it's just like it's not something, it's just how we are. we can't work on that level. So there's 3 levels of suffering from that's talked about in the first noble truth. So there's first level of suffering is just called the suffering of suffering, or the pain of pain. And this is just our everyday kind of what we acknowledge as pain, like stubbing our toe, hitting our head on the door frame, just like the suffering of pain, basic painful experiences. And then there's a kind of more subtler level of suffering that the Buddha spoke on in that first teaching. What he called the suffering of change, or transitoriness, kind of the ups and downs of life, the fact that nothing stays the same, so nothing ever lasts. So the weather, sort of those in Florida, we know, like the beach experience, the sun feels great, and then it hurts because it's too hot, and then we jump in the water and it feels great, and then especially on the West Coast, because the Pacific's the water is cold, like it gets cold fast. So then the pleasure turns into discomfort, and then we get out of the water, and then the sun feels great, and then it gets too hot, and we jump back. And our life is kind of pervaded by this kind of constant, kind of shifting. Feels good to relax into the bed, but if we sit in bed for three days, our body will start to ache. There's always a perpetual change. And what happens in that process of change is, in our minds, there we kind of tune that out for a moment, or for a long time, and then we can kind of, we get into a process where we're just constantly trying to manage the external conditions, rather than acknowledging that everything is changing. And it's stressful because things are constantly shifting, and it's hard to manage our external world. And that trying to manage our external world in a way that's unrealistic creates our suffering. So if we're investing too much in some things, it will, the reality will kind of push back on us, and we'll learn, we'll get the lesson that it's not that way. And there, the point is not that we can't enjoy our lives. It's that it's when we get stuck, when we freeze, when we're trying to manage too much. Like we stick on something, and life is like a river; it's flowing. So then there becomes stress, frustration, and so forth. So that's the second layer, is this kind of suffering of change. Things are changing, and we want them to be the same. And then the third kind of subtlest layer of suffering is what is called this kind of suffering of pervasive condition, all pervasive suffering, or all pervasive dukkha. There's a lot of ways we kind of talk about this, but one way I'll share is that there's a kind of there's almost like a fundamental anxiety deeply embedded in just existing as like a me, just this sense of I'm me and you're you, and there's me and there's other, and there's self, in the world, that there's this like deep kind of automatic sense of self or ourselves that is as being inherently separate from others and everything else, that is anxiety producing at its nature. And the Buddhist tradition would call it this kind of innate clinging, kind of grasping at me, or innate self-grasping. In a way, we can kind of have some parallels to like the Darwin's like survival instinct. There's almost like this kind of survival instinct. It's not quite that. And so and this kind of quality kind of pervades our experience. So everything that we experience from this kind of place is kind of tainted. Sometimes the tradition would say like polluted or contaminated. It's kind of tainted by this kind of sense of meanness, me. That's that's just kind of the backdrop of our experience. That the Buddha says is not our nature. Actually, it's a reactionary process that's very deeply ingrained in our minds, but it's something that can be released. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Confusing? Both? Any question?
Hi, Justin. I think that made quite a bit of sense. I've been around that all pervasive suffering for a little while and can't say that I completely grasped it. And now I'm grasping it along with my ego. So thank you. That was a great explanation for that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, they say there's like two kind of, there's a learned sense of identity that, I'm an American, or this or I'm that we kind of enculturated sense of self. And then there's like a really deep, subtler sense of like grasping at meanness, not meanness, but meanness. The I. Sometimes I'll say the I. This kind of thing. And that takes time to kind of uncover. And one of the processes is what are they talking about when they talk about this kind of sense of self. And you may see this kind of word around in the Buddhist tradition, like selflessness or no self or emptiness. It's not that we don't have a sense of self. There's this kind of like contraction into ourselves, or kind of solidifying in our sense of self that kind of cuts us off, that kind of provokes this kind of basic anxiety that when seen through, when we see that it's actually just a mental kind of thing, through very, very deep, it's not an easy thing to release. It's very difficult to release, but that's the kind of source that we're actually releasing, that the nature of ourself is actually open and free. And this kind of isolating sense of me that we're always living with, and kind of it's always kind of bothering us, or kind of haunting us, or creating stress and anxiety, fear, and so forth. That's actually, yeah, that can be released in this kind of openness and sense of interconnectedness and union with this kind of deeper, freer quality of mind and reality is actually our true nature. Yeah. So it's interesting. I've heard a Tibetan teacher kind of throw a little bit different spin on the Four Noble Truths, and so instead of suffering, he used the word fear, which I thought was quite interesting. So kind of the truth of fear, the cause of fear, the end of the end of fear, and the path to end that fear. And I think it's kind of talking from this angle that's kind of all pervasive suffering. Yeah. And so in the progression of that teaching, so we went through these kind of levels of suffering and the cause, how it's possible that cause can be released, how we can live from a place that's not within these three levels of suffering. So yeah, in some level we can say it's a bit of acceptance. So like we accept that there's going to be aches and pains in life. So that first level of suffering is just fact. So it's not really a bummer in a way. Like sometimes it can feel like dark, like Buddhists all they do is talk about suffering and like too serious. It's not so much that, it's more just not burdening ourselves with fear and denial, that kind of wanting to avoid something or trying to change something. Like that there can be a peace and a kind of courage and a sense of humor and freedom and the acknowledgement itself, or the acceptance of of how life is. So aches and pains happen, we stub our toes, cars, get in accidents, different things. And then again, with that suffering that's changed, the fact that life things come and go, we can have a bit of a more lighthearted touch with our day-to-day life. So, 5 o'clock when I'm done with my work, it's not going to, the gates of heaven aren't going to open up. It might be a nice little relief. It'd be nice to get up off my computer and go for a walk or something like that, but it's not going to save me forever. Or, whatever delights us is delightful, and it's, but we can have a bit of a light touch knowing it's just kind of the flow of life. And when hardships come, again, if we can bring in that kind of consciousness of things come and go, again, that starts to release some of the pressure and pain. Because oftentimes when something difficult happens, that first reaction is like, it's never going to end. It's like cognitively, like and that creates the intensity in us, actually, is that mistaken view that it's never, this is like, when is this going to end? There's this fear, like it's going to overtake us or envelop us, which is a natural response. Actually, it's not, we're not judging that, but just noticing that attitude itself is what's kind of bringing more fuel to the fire of our discomfort and our pain, actually. So the what we might encounter is painful, but this extra layer of feeling that's always going to be there, or that actually is where we might have some some freedom to pull back on, so the pain itself isn't as much. And then even in some ways we might go through a painful situation and still actually have perspective that it is going to change, and it's painful, but yes, and this is true, and then our minds can open, and our experience of it can be more free. Yeah. Yeah, so what the Buddha found is that there's just kind of a sense of peace and bliss and freedom in acknowledging things as they are. So having this kind of knowledge that things change, things are, there is going to be pain in life. It's a mixed bag, and that insight alone can be a very profound kind of medicine for our sanity. One of the Buddha said of all the different teachings, like the one that is like an elephant's print in the jungle, like it leaves deepest impression, deepest impact, is this kind of understanding that things change, or constantly changing. It somehow can bring a lot of peace and sanity and perspective instantly, maybe so more than any other kind of teaching we might find in the tradition. Because it's a very simple truth, but it has a lot of potency there to help us come back. People, and maybe before we take a break, any comments or questions, thoughts? Sure. Okay. People, how are we feeling? Maybe a 3 to 5 minute break. That's good.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, so let's maybe start again in about 5 minutes.
Okay. Noon.
I will stop the recording.
Okay, so maybe 15 minutes, so we could do a short meditation at the end. Yeah, okay. So the first teaching happened. So the Buddha had his awakening, and then some weeks later ran into his dear spiritual friends in a park called Deer Park in what's known as Sarnath, India. And the Buddha had this, he shared this teaching. It's interesting about the Buddha's approach. He wasn't like you wouldn't say preach. The Buddha really just had this incredible ability and willingness to just respond to people with whatever they needed, whatever was helpful for them to hear. So sometimes he would even contradict himself if it would help that person he encountered. So so the Buddha wasn't attached to he wasn't like building a doctrine, or he didn't have he wasn't a CEO building had this plan of building. He just had this compassionate, spontaneous responses to beings that he encountered, and the teachings kind of flowed out from that, those conditions. Because really the Buddhist tradition even recognizes itself as merely a tool. So we use the tool to benefit ourselves, benefit others, free ourselves from these kind of three levels of suffering. And then there's a famous discussion the Buddha had, saying if you cross, if you use a raft or paddleboard or ocean kayak to get to cross the body of water, once you get to the other shore, you ask the question, would you carry it on your back or leave it? Actually, maybe the modern's not, because those things are expensive, so that's not a good analogy anymore. But back then it was just, maybe raft was just like pieces of wood, no value. Once you got it across for the purpose, you wouldn't burden yourself with it. You wouldn't hold on to it as this kind of identification. So, he has recognized that the Dharma, the teachings, are for us to free ourselves and free others, and that's it. They don't exist for themselves. Dharma doesn't exist as its own thing. It's just a process, a liberating process that human beings go through. They don't have some sort of substantial grasp. And that kind of actually leads us to historically how the Buddhist tradition progressed. Let's do this in maybe like in 10 minutes. The Buddha started what they call the first turning of the wheel, and gave the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. And then about 400 years after the Buddha was a Buddhist, brilliant Buddhist master named Nagarjuna. And he's kind of credited with bringing public, or kind of starting this wave of teachings called what they're called the Prajnaparamita, or it's usually translated the perfection of wisdom, the teachings on the perfection of wisdom. And this was kind of a, looking back now, we don't, with the lived experience, very different, but it's kind of formally how we kind of look at that historical kind of moment, was this kind of subtler insight into what is called the teachings on emptiness. So maybe like science moves into quantum physics, in our kind of cultural, looking at it from this place where there are teachings that nothing has a findable essence in itself. So meditating, being a spiritual person, being a worldly person, or whatever you want to call it, atoms. So in the early teachings, there was this kind of idea of, they call it partless particles. So it's like there was a belief in like the kind of basic substance of the universe, where these kind of almost like their theory of atoms, like the smallest particles in existence, where the building blocks of our physical world and our reality. And the teachings on emptiness show that even those are empty, like that nothing can't have parts. Like if we take an atom, the atom has a top, it has a bottom, it has a left, it has a right. It gets it's too much to teach. Go into in a couple minutes. But yeah, there was this kind of deeper, kind of profound movement of teachings called the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, which were concerned on the emptiness. So all phenomena in reality have this kind of insubstantial nature. Things appear and exist more like rainbows rather than solid actual things. You could say. And also around that time was the movement of the Mahayana. So kind of early Buddhism, we could say, had more focus on the liberation of the individual. We could free ourselves from our own suffering conditions, our own psychological pain, and release us from this kind of instinctual sense of self and experience nirvana and this kind of open freedom. But there was a bit of a kind of a container that was a little too solid, and these teachings of emptiness kind of opened up what's called the Bodhisattva path and this idea of full enlightenment in Buddhahood, and the Bodhisattva idea where our own spiritual path is a kind of a universal project. So with Solanus Dalai Lama talks about universal responsibility. There's this that my mind can actually open to the universe, and I can be this kind of I can trudge through the challenges of the world with this kind of like dreamlike wisdom, where no matter this kind of duality of what's spiritual, what's not, is kind of released, and these beings, bodhisattvas, are able to actually engage in the world in a very profound way, and so their enlightenment is this kind of compassionate drive to be of support and to be of help for all beings' enlightenment. So it's not just an individual kind of project, it's actually a universal project. So my enlightenment's intimately tied to every other being that has a mind. And the teachings on emptiness kind of show the open possibility that we can have this very profound kind of awakening that can benefit many beings. So you'll hear, so the model of enlightenment from this point of view is almost a sense of service. I'd say like you're becoming enlightened so that our own ego challenges and stuff are released, and we can be like a sun that radiates these qualities, and is just a constant kind of spontaneous vehicle of service to the world, because nothing impedes it, because everything has this empty quality. There's nothing that impedes this kind of enlightened response. Nothing too dark, nothing too difficult, nothing too whatever impure or whatever that can stand in the way of this kind of this powerful wisdom and compassion when they're united in a path. Yeah, so that was called the second turning, and then the kind of third movement in the next 200 years or so after, or maybe 600 years after the Buddha. There was a Buddhist master named Asanga, who's also kind of credited with helping bring forth the teachings on the Buddha nature. And so it's an interesting kind of personal reflection. So we talk about suffering as a foundation and what's causing our pain. what's these kind of psychological linchpins that are holding us in our patterns and kind of trapping us. What's our own personal style of how we're imprisoned in certain kind of patterns. And then we develop that insight. It becomes very direct and powerful. And then there's these kind of teachings that around emptiness, where even more subtler, where it's just like we can actually just let go of everything. And there's this kind of profound openness to reality. That like the nature of life and the nature of ourselves is not just like I can just be free, but actually it's like I'm a completely wide open sky. Like my true nature is this kind of vast open emptiness. And so the emptiness is like a letting go process. Letting go, how we keep holding on, keep letting go. But that can also create a quality of like almost like nihilism. It has a bit of a flavor because it is negating, like, it can be mistaken for nihilism, like nothing exists, everything's empty. So like there's just nothing, and the universe is empty, or the universe is nothingness. And it the wisdom aspect of it is it cuts through and allows us to continually let go in more and more subtler ways, and continue to open and be open-minded. But the other side of it, it can be kind of, depressing or nihilistic. And it doesn't show the full picture. So the awareness of emptiness, or this mind that, this wisdom actually has qualities. So the third turning of the teachings were about what's the actual experience of being enlightened, what's the qualities of the Buddha nature, or what's the qualities of our potential, not just the empty, not just this letting go process, but what are the riches and kind of abilities of a mind that is freed in this way. And so the Buddha nature teachings kind of came along to kind of explicitly describe enlightenment or awakening. So so when a mind is freed in this way, it has kind of unconditional love, unconditional compassion, spontaneous wisdom that's able to respond to beings. Like we become, instead of having to like think about what to say or think about what would be good for this person, or how can I show up and be of support and so forth. This kind of awakened mind is just like it's just a mirror that's reflecting this kind of universal love and wisdom back at beings. Whether or not you speak the language or not, it's like if it's an animal, there's this kind of, it's just radiating this kind of mirror-like wisdom that is just part of our nature. So Buddha nature is very inspiring. That's like the inspiring kind of package to kind of meditate on. That every being has this kind of, our minds aren't just this selflessness, emptiness, and letting go process. It's very rich, loving, goodness, kind of unconditional goodness. That's the nature of ourselves. And that can be very powerful because, the evolutionary science of Darwin has been kind of co-opted in a way that, like our nature is inherently selfish and competitive and combative, and we're survivalists and we'll do whatever it takes. But actually, what's a lot of the neuroscience today is showing that actually human beings are and what Darwin actually said at the time was, we want to survive, but our survival was dependent on cooperation and collaboration and connection and empathy. We're a social creature, and we needed that. So we had to develop that social, emotional intelligence to actually survive as a species. And we're actually wired for compassion, wired for kindness, wired for connection and peace. It's actually how our brains work, and it's our bodies are healthy, our minds are healthy, our spirit is healthy when we are meeting those needs in us. Yeah, and a nice term that was coined in English as a kind of alternative to the Buddha nature is basic goodness, that we have this kind of basic goodness that's fundamental to who we are. And next week, we'll actually get into a little bit of kind of the basic principles of Buddhist psychology and what the mind is, definition of mind in the Buddhist tradition, and how it functions, and how we can arrive at the understanding of this basic goodness. Yeah. So maybe that's content we'll cover today. Any brief questions before we do a little meditation?
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You spoke about free and powerful as a result of the sort of turning of the wheel. And so if you would say a little more about how you see that power, say a little more about power.
Power. Yeah. Yeah, so they say the three kind of main qualities, if you were to kind of boil the Buddha nature into three aspects, they say wisdom, compassion, or love, and power. And power means, you could say, like effectiveness, like impactfulness. So wisdom, we could say is wisdom's almost like, okay, we have this understanding. Compassion, we have a sense of resonance, or we can feel what their, empathy and sympathy for another being. And then power is kind of putting that into action, like an ability to engage and impact. So the Buddha had, the wisdom, experience, and insight. He had the compassionate heart and just the compassionate empathy and sympathy for beings naturally, but also did things. Was able to communicate with beings and help beings kind of create a supportive condition for beings to recognize insights in their own selves. So it's kind of power is the kind of ability to make an impact, to communicate with beings. Like Lama Yeshe would say, like, are we communicating or not? Is there communication happening? Like, I'm talking, but is there some sort of communication happening? So it's that ability to have an impact on others. But at the same time, the power isn't like a genie or magic. It's not like the Buddha can just liberate, or the Buddha's not a savior. Like, reality doesn't work that way. The Buddha recognized that, and I think that's why one of the approaches with Buddha's teachings, like, don't accept what I'm saying just because I'm famous and trending in India right now. A lot of followers, and he was kind of the very popular guru at the time. So don't listen to me just because there's all these people around, and it looked like, like, because that doesn't actually work. That actually doesn't help you. If we just impose a belief system on ourselves, even if we do it ourselves, we do it. We can do that ourselves. It doesn't always. It's not the imposition. It isn't always from others, but if we do that on ourselves, it doesn't bring about a personal internal insight. Doesn't bring the transformation. Like from the Buddhist point of view, how like our learning process, like we'll hear a concept and maybe we hadn't thought of that concept before, and then we hear it and like a bell goes off and something about it rings true, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I can see how everything changes. And so that becomes like one level of understanding, and there could be some benefit in that. But to take it to a deeper, for it to really, truly, deeply impact us, we have to have a contemplative inner dialogue with it to like make the understanding become deeper. So it's like, that saying, like bringing it from our heads to our hearts, or like we really need to have this insight in our bones. Like it needs to become like something that's really in us. It's not just kind of a fleeting idea that's inspiring when we think about it, but it's not actually changing how we experience life or changing how we live. And yeah, so that process actually has to come from the individual. But when somebody who has really cultivated these qualities, that wisdom radiates from them, and so the conditions that they can create for others can be very powerful. And there's stories like at times when the Buddha was teaching, he would create this kind of atmosphere that somebody would just hear something and it was just like, like they got it, and they got it. Like it was just like, oh, because the presence in the atmosphere that the Buddha was creating with the kind of Buddha's living wisdom was so powerful that it just set the stage for somebody who was ready to really get it in a deep way. So that's the kind of power. It's like this the effective ability to kind of, it's like creating very powerful supportive conditions for others based on their presence. And then if any of us have met some, great teachers of His Holiness Dalai Lama, Zopa Rinpoche, people who are just completely wide open, just the presence, there's something very palpable and powerful in the presence, that everything just becomes very heightened and effective. So again, like they're not saving us in a particular way, but they can be a supportive condition to help speed along our understanding.
So very helpful. Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah, I need to cultivate the power of time management, which I still do not have. So actually, yeah, so the meditation we'll do that. It makes more sense. We do that at the beginning of the next time anyway, but we can maybe take a few minutes of doing this kind of contemplation. So you just want to close our eyes or turn inward for a moment. And bring to mind anything that can struck you today. Anything that was inspiring or Just holding that insight or impact in our mind as we breathe. And we see many feelings of interest or inspiration. And then reflecting again on our contemplation at the start of the class about our values of love and compassion. And reaffirming the truth of these values. How important they are to us. And I feel like we can make an aspiration or dedicating that whatever positive insights or potential or energy that we may have generated, created together, any little seeds that have been planted in our minds or hearts this morning, dedicating them as supports that they may be as beneficial and impactful as possible. They may become causes for us to develop our insight, awaken our potential as humans, so that we may be of lasting value to all living beings without exception. To help enable them to also awaken their full potential. Okay, thanks so much. You'll have a good Sunday.
Thank you. I will stop the recording.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Justin. Great class.
Thanks.